In this episode, we move from the idea of ownership to the proof of ownership, because in AI governance, it is not enough for someone to say they are responsible. When accountability gets tested, it is tested with evidence, and evidence means records that show who had authority, who reviewed what, and who accepted what risks. Beginners sometimes picture evidence as something only auditors care about, like paperwork that appears at the end of a project, but strong evidence is actually a safety feature. It prevents confusion when teams change, when memories fade, or when a decision becomes controversial after the fact. Evidence also helps people act with confidence, because they can see what is expected and what has already been agreed to. The goal here is to understand the kinds of artifacts that show ownership is real in practice, and to learn how to evaluate whether those artifacts are meaningful or just decorative. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first concept to anchor is that AI ownership evidence should answer 4 simple questions in a way that is hard to argue with. Who has authority to make decisions about this system and its use? Who is accountable for the system's risks and outcomes over time? Who is responsible for operating the controls that reduce risk? Who maintains the standards and rules that define what acceptable looks like? If a set of documents cannot clearly answer those questions, ownership is probably ambiguous no matter what people say in meetings. Evidence should be discoverable, consistent, and current, meaning it can be found when needed. It does not contradict itself, and it matches how the organization actually works today. Many governance failures happen because evidence exists but is outdated, or because it describes an ideal process that no one follows. Evaluating evidence means comparing the written story to the real behavior of the organization and noticing gaps that could become risks. A charter is often the foundation document that gives a group or program its authority, so it is a strong place to start. A charter explains why a governance body exists, what it is responsible for, what powers it has, and how it interacts with other groups. Beginners should think of a charter like the rules that establish a student council, spelling out what it can decide and how it represents the school. For AI governance, a charter might define a committee or steering group that oversees high-impact AI systems. When evaluating a charter, you want to see clear scope, such as what kinds of AI uses fall under the group's oversight, and clear authority, such as whether it can require changes or block deployment. If a charter uses vague language like provides guidance without stating decision rights, it may look formal but fail to create accountability. You also want to see membership rules and escalation paths, because a governance group with unclear composition or unclear escalation will struggle when disagreements arise. A charter should also show how governance connects to the broader organization rather than floating in isolation. If a charter describes responsibilities that overlap with other groups, such as security, privacy, legal, or risk management, it should explain how conflicts are resolved and who has final authority in specific areas. Beginners often assume overlap is always bad, but overlap can be healthy if the boundaries are clear and there is a known process for resolving differences. When evaluating the quality of a charter, you can look for concrete decision types, such as approving high-risk use cases or setting required controls, rather than general aspirations like promoting responsible AI. You can also look for frequency and cadence, meaning how often the group meets and how it handles urgent decisions. A governance body that meets rarely may be unable to respond when AI risks surface quickly. Evidence is strongest when it describes both steady-state routines and what happens during exceptions and incidents. Another common artifact is a responsibility mapping approach called responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, or ACI, which is meant to make roles explicit for key tasks. Beginners may have never seen an ACI before, but the idea is straightforward. For each governance activity, it names who does the work, who is accountable for the outcome, who must be consulted, and who must be kept informed. The value of an ACI is that it turns vague ownership into a map of who does what. When evaluating an ACI, the first check is whether the tasks listed actually match the life cycle of AI, such as approving a use case, reviewing data sources, monitoring performance, handling incidents, and approving changes. If the RACI only covers early-stage design and ignores ongoing operation, it may create a false sense of control. The second check is whether accountability is assigned clearly, because an RACI that assigns multiple accountable roles for the same task often creates confusion rather than clarity. A strong RACI also aligns with real authority, which means the people marked accountable must have the power to require action. If a role is marked accountable but lacks budget, influence, or access to decision-makers, the map is not realistic. Another red flag is when the consulted and informed categories are overloaded, because that can signal a process that is too heavy to follow. Evidence should support governance, not make it impossible to operate. You also want to check whether the RACI is used in practice, which can be inferred from whether it is referenced in approvals, training, or workflow documentation. A document that exists but is never used is not strong evidence, even if it looks polished. Beginners should develop the instinct to ask whether the artifact shapes behavior, because ownership evidence must drive real decisions rather than sit in a folder. Approvals and sign-offs are the next major category, and they are often the most persuasive evidence because they show that decisions were made by authorized people at specific times. An approval is a recorded decision that something is allowed, such as allowing an AI system to launch, allowing a specific data source to be used, or allowing a new capability to be introduced. A sign-off is a confirmation that a review was completed and the reviewer accepts the result, such as confirming a risk assessment was reviewed or confirming required controls are in place. When evaluating approvals and sign-offs, you want to see a clear link between the decision and the evidence that supported it. A signature with no supporting context does not show responsible ownership. It only shows someone's name was attached. Strong sign-offs reference the criteria that were applied and the scope of what was reviewed, so that later readers can understand what the approval actually covered. Beginners should also learn that the absence of approvals can be evidence of weak governance. If a high-impact AI system is in use but there is no record of a go-live decision, no record of risk acceptance, and no record of required control verification, that strongly suggests ownership is unclear. On the other hand, approvals that exist but are inconsistent can also be a problem. For example, if one system has extensive sign-offs while a similar system has none, governance may be applied unevenly, often based on who is building the system or how visible it is. A governance model that depends on visibility creates shadow AI, where teams quietly deploy systems to avoid scrutiny. Evaluating evidence includes checking for consistent treatment across similar systems and understanding whether exceptions are documented and justified. Evidence becomes meaningful when it reflects a stable rule rather than a one-time effort. A crucial part of evaluating approval evidence is understanding what the approval was for, because AI systems can change in ways that alter risk. An approval to pilot a system for internal testing is not the same as approval to use it in production. An approval for one use case is not the same as approval for another. If approvals do not specify scope, people may reuse an approval for new situations where it does not apply. That is a common governance failure because it creates a false sense of authorization. Strong approvals include boundaries, such as which users, which data, which environment, and which decisions are allowed. They also include conditions, such as required monitoring or periodic review. Beginners should notice that scope is a form of risk control because it limits where and how harm could occur. If evidence does not capture scope, then ownership is hard to prove when someone asks who authorized a particular outcome. It is also important to look for decision trails that show how the organization reached a conclusion, not just the conclusion itself. A decision trail is the path from identifying an issue, to discussing options, to choosing an action, to documenting the rationale and the responsible roles. Beginners can think of this as the difference between a teacher writing a final grade and a teacher showing the rubric and how the grade was derived. When AI systems face scrutiny, decision trails help explain why choices were reasonable at the time, even if outcomes later reveal issues. They also help teams learn, because they can review what assumptions were made and whether those assumptions held. When evaluating decision trails, you look for evidence that alternatives were considered and that the rationale connects to standards and risk appetite. You also look for traceability, meaning the trail links to who approved what and which version or configuration of the system the decision applied to. Charters, RACI mappings, approvals, and sign-offs often fail in predictable ways, and beginners should learn to spot those patterns. One failure is generic language that could apply to any project because it hides the specific risks of AI. Another is unclear authority, where a group is said to oversee AI but lacks the power to block risky actions. Another is missing lifecycle coverage, where evidence exists for initial design but not for ongoing monitoring and change. Another is outdated artifacts, where documents refer to teams or processes that no longer exist. Another is inconsistent application, where some systems are heavily governed and others are ignored. Each of these failures creates ambiguity, and ambiguity is the enemy of accountability. Evaluating evidence is about seeing whether the organization has built a reliable habit of showing who owns what, across time and across systems. A subtle but important point is that evidence should be accessible to the people who need it at the time they need it, without heroic effort. If ownership evidence is buried, difficult to find, or stored in a way that only one person can access, it becomes fragile. Fragile evidence is almost as bad as no evidence, because during an incident or an audit, the organization may not be able to demonstrate responsible governance. Good governance treats evidence as part of operations, not a special activity. That means records are created as decisions happen, and they are stored in consistent places with clear naming and version tracking. Beginners do not need to memorize specific systems or tools for this. They only need the principle that evidence must be retrievable and understandable. If a new person joins the team, they should be able to reconstruct who owns what and why, using the evidence, without relying on informal conversations. Another practical evaluation approach is to compare different artifacts against each other and look for contradictions. A charter might say one group approves deployments, while an RACI claims another role is accountable for approval. Approvals might show a person signing off who is not named in any charter or RACI. Standards might require certain reviews, but sign-offs show approvals happening without those reviews. Contradictions are not always malicious. They often happen because organizations evolve faster than their documentation. However, contradictions create governance risk because they make it unclear who truly has authority. In a crisis, people may argue about who is allowed to act, wasting time and increasing harm. Evaluating evidence means identifying contradictions and treating them as signals that governance needs repair. Clear ownership evidence should tell a single coherent story, even when multiple teams are involved. The most practical measure of ownership evidence is whether it supports accountability when something goes wrong. If an AI system causes harm, can you show who was accountable for accepting that risk, who was accountable for maintaining controls, who had authority to decide on deployment and pause actions, and who owned the standards that defined acceptable practice? Can you show what was reviewed, what criteria were applied, and what rationale supported the decision? Can you show that governance applied to the system consistently across its life cycle, not just at the beginning? If the evidence can answer these questions, it is strong enough to support learning and improvement instead of blame and chaos. If it cannot, then even well-intentioned teams may find themselves unable to explain their actions credibly. That is why evaluating evidence is not paperwork for its own sake. It is a core part of responsible AI governance. The big idea to carry forward is that AI governance becomes real when ownership can be demonstrated, not just described, and the demonstration comes from charters, RACI mappings, approvals, and sign-offs that actually shape behavior. Charters should clearly establish authority and scope for governance bodies. RACI mappings should clearly assign responsibility and accountability for lifecycle tasks in a realistic way. Approvals and sign-offs should show who decided what, when, and based on what criteria, with clear scope and conditions. When those artifacts are consistent, current, and used, they create a strong decision trail that protects the organization and the people inside it. When they are vague, outdated, inconsistent, or ignored, they create ambiguity that will surface at the worst possible time. If you learn to evaluate these ownership artifacts with a practical eye, you will be able to spot weak governance early, before it turns into unmanaged risk, and before the organization pays the price for confusion.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.